I never expected to find a man buried alive that summer. His desperate promise changed my life forever, and it taught me that sometimes justice requires more than just waiting for karma. My name is Emily Carter, and by the time I turned 12, I knew more about hardship than most adults. We lived in Pinewood Hills, a small town divided by invisible lines between the wealthy estates on the north side and the struggling neighborhoods on the south. Our tiny two-bedroom house sat at the very edge of South Pinewood, where the pavement started to crack and the streetlights flickered more often than they shined. Mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat after Dad left 4 years ago. She cleaned houses for the wealthy families during the day and waitressed at Lenny's diner during evenings. I rarely saw her except for our Sunday mornings together, when she would make pancakes shaped like animals and tell me stories about when she was my age. School was my escape. I excelled in every subject, especially math and science. My teachers often told my mother that I was gifted. They said I could earn scholarships one day if I kept my grades up, but textbooks cost money, field trips cost money. Even the special science program I qualified for required fees we simply could not afford. Our neighborhood had one saving grace. The dense woods that bordered the eastern edge of town provided a natural playground that cost nothing to enjoy. I spent most of my summer days exploring those woods, creating maps of the terrain and collecting interesting rocks and leaves for my homemade science journal. Mom worried about me wandering alone, but we both knew there were few alternatives. Summer camp was for kids whose parents could afford the registration fees. The summer I turned 12 started like any other. Mom picked up extra shifts cleaning a new mansion that had been built on Hillcrest Drive, the most exclusive street in Pinewood. The owner was Maxwell Stone, a tech millionaire who had recently moved to our town. Everyone talked about him. Some said he was a genius who had invented software that changed the world. Others whispered that he had stepped on countless people to reach the top. I never expected to meet him. People like the Stones existed in a different universe than people like us. They shopped at different stores. Their children attended private schools. They breathed different air. At least that was what I believed until that fateful day in July when everything changed. That morning, Mom left earlier than usual. She told me she needed to prepare the Stone mansion for an important dinner party. She reminded me to stay close to home and be back before dark. I promised I would, already planning my expedition to the eastern woods to continue mapping the small creek I had discovered the previous week. The day was perfectly warm with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves above me as I walked deeper into the forest. I carried my backpack filled with essentials: a water bottle, a peanut butter sandwich, my notebook and colored pencils, a small first aid kit Mom insisted I carry, and my most prized possession, a compass that had belonged to my grandfather. I followed the creek for nearly an hour, carefully noting its twists and turns in my notebook. The water trickled peacefully over smooth stones, creating a soothing soundtrack to my adventure. Birds called to each other overhead. Occasionally a squirrel or rabbit would freeze at the sight of me before darting away into the underbrush. The creek led me to a part of the woods I had never explored before. The trees grew denser here, casting deep shadows across the forest floor. I noticed something unusual. The ground ahead had been disturbed. At first I thought it might have been animals digging, but the area was too large and too uniform. My curiosity pulled me forward. As I approached, I realized it looked like freshly turned soil, as if someone had been digging. A chill ran down my spine despite the summer heat. Something felt wrong about this scene. I considered turning back, but then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A muffled cry for help. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again. A human voice, weak but desperate, coming from beneath the disturbed soil. My heart pounded against my ribs as the reality of what I was seeing sank in. Someone was buried underground. Fear told me to run, to find an adult who could handle this situation. But another voice inside reminded me that by the time I reached town and brought someone back, it might be too late. I dropped my backpack and fell to my knees, beginning to dig with my bare hands. The soil was loose and gave way easily. I worked frantically, pausing only to listen for the voice and ensure I was digging in the right spot. After several minutes, my fingers struck something solid. Wood. I cleared more dirt away and realized I had found a wooden box. It was a makeshift coffin, hastily constructed but sturdy enough to hold the weight of the soil above it. I cleared the dirt from what appeared to be the top of the box and found the edge. With all my strength, I tried to lift it. It barely moved, but it was enough to create a small opening. That was when I heard the voice more clearly. The man inside told me to keep digging. He sounded weak and terrified. I worked even faster now, fueled by adrenaline and the knowledge that a human life depended on my efforts. Eventually, I had cleared enough dirt to reveal a portion of the lid. I noticed it had air holes drilled into it. Whoever had done this wanted their victim to suffer slowly. With one final surge of effort, I managed to push enough soil away to create a larger opening. A hand emerged from the gap, followed by an arm. I grabbed the hand and pulled with all my might. Working together, we gradually widened the opening until the man could pull himself up and out. He collapsed on the ground beside the grave, gasping for fresh air. His expensive suit was soiled and torn. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, from what looked like a head wound. Despite his disheveled appearance, I recognized him instantly from the newspaper photos. Maxwell Stone, the millionaire. He looked at me with eyes wide with disbelief. He asked how old I was. I told him I was 12. He asked what I was doing in the woods alone. I explained about my mapping project. He asked my name. I told him I was Emily Carter. His eyes filled with tears as he processed what had happened. He told me that his business partners had betrayed him. They had arranged for him to be kidnapped, beaten, and buried alive in the woods. They planned to take control of his company, while everyone believed he had simply disappeared. The air holes were meant to prolong his suffering, while ensuring he would eventually die of dehydration. I told him we needed to call the police. He grabbed my arm, his expression suddenly intense. He told me that his partners were powerful people with connections throughout the town. If they discovered he was still alive before he could gather evidence against them, we would both be in danger. I suggested going to my mother. He asked who she was. When I told him she worked as a cleaner, including at his house, his expression changed. He asked if my mother was Sarah Carter. I nodded, surprised he knew her name. He shook his head in disbelief. He told me he had only met my mother briefly, but he remembered her because she had a photo of me on her keychain. He said it was like fate that her daughter would be the one to save him. Maxwell looked around nervously, clearly afraid his attackers might return. He told me he needed a place to hide while he contacted people he could trust. He asked if I would help him. I hesitated, knowing that bringing a stranger home would break every rule my mother had ever taught me. But this was different. This man would have died without my help. The walk back through the woods was tense and slow. Maxwell was weak from his ordeal, and we had to stop frequently for him to rest. As we walked, he told me more about his situation. His company had developed a revolutionary new technology that would make clean water accessible in developing countries. But his partners wanted to sell the technology to the highest bidder instead of using it for humanitarian purposes as Maxwell had intended. I asked why he had moved to our small town if he was such an important businessman. He explained that he had grown up poor in a town very much like Pinewood. His success had taken him to big cities around the world, but he had wanted to return to a small community. He told me it was important to remember where you came from. When we reached the edge of the woods, Maxwell was too weak to continue without help. I offered him my shoulder to lean on as we made our way through the back streets, avoiding the main roads where someone might recognize him. By the time we reached my house, the sun was beginning to set. Our home looked especially small and shabby as I unlocked the door and helped Maxwell inside. He collapsed onto our worn sofa, exhaustion finally overtaking him. I brought him water and our limited first aid supplies. As I helped clean the cut on his head, he looked around our modest living room. His eyes fell on the wall of academic certificates and awards I'd earned at school. He told me I must be very smart. I shrugged and said that being smart did not matter much when you were poor. The words came out more bitter than I had intended. He studied me for a long moment before asking about my future plans. I told him about my dream of becoming a scientist someday, if I could ever afford college. Mom would not be home until late because of the dinner party at the Stone Mansion. The irony that she was cleaning the home of the very man sitting on our sofa was not lost on me. I made us simple sandwiches, which Maxwell ate as if it were a gourmet meal. He had not eaten since being kidnapped nearly 24 hours earlier. As night fell, Maxwell used our phone to make a single call. He spoke quietly, using what seemed to be code words. When he finished, he told me that help would arrive in the morning. His most trusted security advisor would come with evidence they needed and help him reach safety. He asked if he could stay the night. I knew Mom would be shocked to find him here, but I also knew she would understand once she heard the whole story. I made up the couch with our spare blankets and brought him a pillow. Before he lay down to rest, Maxwell looked at me with an intensity that made me nervous. He told me that he owed me his life. He said that he would never forget what I had done for him today. Then he leaned closer and whispered something that made me freeze. He told me he knew about my mother. He knew her secret. I asked what he meant. His expression softened with compassion. He whispered that he knew my mother had been stealing from the homes she cleaned. He had discovered jewelry from his own safe in her cleaning supplies last week, but had not reported it because he had noticed how worn her shoes were, how thin she had become. He said he recognized the signs of desperation. Tears filled my eyes as his words sank in. I had noticed Mom bringing home small items over the past few months. A watch, a pair of earrings, a silver letter opener. She had claimed they were gifts from grateful employers or items they had planned to discard. I had chosen to believe her because the alternative was too painful to consider. Maxwell promised me that he would never tell anyone about what my mother had done. But there was something in his voice, a note of calculation that made my tears dry up. He told me he had a proposal for both of us, a way to help my family and himself at the same time. The plan he outlined made my head spin. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. He would pretend to remain missing for a few more days while his security team gathered evidence against his partners. During that time, my mother and I would play crucial roles in his scheme. In return, he would ensure my future education was fully funded, and my mother would never need to clean another house or work another double shift. I asked why he would do this for us. He said it was partly gratitude for saving his life. But he also admitted that he needed people his enemies would never suspect. A cleaning woman and her young daughter were perfect accomplices, precisely because no one would ever believe they could be involved in corporate espionage. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake bringing Maxwell Stone into our home. I wondered if his plan would work, or if it would bring disaster upon our family. Most of all, I wondered what my mother would say when she came home to find a supposedly missing millionaire sleeping on our couch. I heard her key in the lock just after midnight. I rushed from my bedroom to intercept her before she saw our guest. Her eyes widened as I whispered a hurried explanation. At first she thought I was making up stories. Then her face paled as she peered into the living room and saw Maxwell Stone asleep on our sofa. She pulled me into the kitchen, her hands trembling as she demanded to know exactly what had happened. I told her everything, including what Maxwell had said about her stealing. She sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. She admitted it was true. She had taken small items from the wealthy homes she cleaned, items she thought would not be missed. She had done it to pay for my school supplies, for the medical bills when I had gotten sick last winter, for the repair on our leaking roof. I told her about the deal Maxwell had offered. She listened with growing alarm, shaking her head firmly when I finished. She told me we could not get involved in whatever game Maxwell Stone was playing. She would return everything she had taken and accept whatever consequences came. We would find another way to survive. But as we talked, neither of us noticed that. Maxwell had awakened. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching us with an unreadable expression. He told my mother not to be afraid. He said he understood desperate actions taken out of love. He reminded her that he had grown up poor himself. He described his plan again, this time with more details. My mother would continue working in the homes of his business partners, but now she would be looking for specific documents and listening for particular conversations. I would use my access to the woods to pass messages to his security team waiting at the edge of town. The plan would take exactly 3 days. After that, justice would be served and our lives would change forever. My mother asked what would happen if we refused. Maxwell assured her that he would still keep her secret safe. He would find another way to handle his situation. But the opportunity to secure my future would be gone. I watched my mother carefully. I could see her weighing our limited options, her responsibility as a parent against her moral qualms about what Maxwell was proposing. Finally, she asked what Maxwell would do to his partners when he had the evidence he needed. Would they be harmed? Maxwell shook his head. He told her he only wanted justice, not revenge. His partners would face legal consequences for their actions. Nothing more. He said that violence created only more violence. He believed in the power of the justice system when presented with irrefutable evidence. I could tell the moment my mother made her decision. Her shoulders straightened and her expression hardened with resolve. She would do anything to secure my future, even if it meant temporarily becoming something she never thought she would be. A spy, an accomplice, a woman with secrets. As dawn broke over our small house, the three of us sat at our kitchen table, finalizing the details of our arrangement. None of us could have predicted the events that would follow, or how completely our lives would change. None of us knew that. This was just the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of our courage, our loyalty, and our understanding of right and wrong. None of us realized that saving Maxwell Stone that day in the woods would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not just our lives, but the entire town of Pinewood Hills. Betrayal development. The plan began immediately. Maxwell received a call from his security advisor, a stern-faced woman named Diana who arrived at our house before sunrise. She brought clean clothes, a secure phone, and files containing information about the partners who had betrayed Maxwell. Their names were Victor Reynolds, Lawrence Blackwood, and Eliza Chen. They had worked with Maxwell for years, building Stone Technologies from a startup into a global corporation. Diana explained that these three had formed a secret alliance months ago. They had grown dissatisfied with Maxwell's humanitarian focus and had been approached by a military contractor offering billions for exclusive rights to the water purification technology. Maxwell had repeatedly refused similar offers, insisting their innovation should benefit those most in need, not become a weapon or a luxury for the wealthy. While Diana and Maxwell reviewed documents, my mother prepared for her day. She would be cleaning the Reynolds estate that morning. Maxwell gave her specific instructions about what to look for and where. She was to pay particular attention to Victor's home office and any conversations she might overhear. I watched my mother transform before my eyes. Her usual exhaustion gave way to a focused determination. She dressed in her cleaning uniform, but she carried herself differently now. She was no longer just Sarah Carter, overworked housekeeper. She was a woman with a mission. Before she left, Maxwell gave her a small device that looked like an ordinary pen. He explained it was a recording device that she could use if she heard anything incriminating. My mother slipped it into her pocket with hands that trembled only slightly. Once she departed, Maxwell turned his attention to me. He explained that my role would begin that afternoon. Diana had positioned members of their security team in a cabin at the edge of the woods. I would serve as a courier, bringing any information. My mother gathered to them and returning with further instructions. Maxwell himself would remain hidden in our house. As far as the rest of the world knew, he was still missing. His partners believed him dead, buried in the woods where no one would find him. This misconception was our greatest advantage. The morning passed slowly. I tried to distract myself by reading, but my mind kept returning to my mother and the dangerous game we had agreed to play. Maxwell spent hours on the secure phone, speaking in hushed tones with people he appeared to trust. Diana came and went several times, always checking carefully to ensure she was not followed. At noon, my mother returned with her first report. Her voice was steady as she described what she had discovered. Victor Reynolds had held a private meeting that morning with someone she did not recognize. She had managed to record portions of their conversation while pretending to dust the adjoining room. Maxwell and Diana listened to the recording intently. Victor could be heard discussing shipping arrangements for technology prototypes and mentioning a final meeting scheduled for the following evening at the Stone Mansion. All three partners would be present, along with representatives from the military contractor. My mother also reported another disturbing discovery. While cleaning Victor's bedroom, she had found a gun hidden in his nightstand. This suggested that the partners were prepared for violence if their plans were threatened. Maxwell thanked my mother for the information and assured her she had done well. As she prepared a simple lunch for all of us, I noticed how Maxwell watched her with a thoughtful expression. There was something in his gaze I could not quite decipher. Respect, certainly, but also something else, something calculating. After lunch, it was my turn. Maxwell gave me a sealed envelope to deliver to the security team waiting at the edge of the woods. He instructed me to follow my usual route through the forest, but to be especially alert for anyone who might be watching. The partners might have hired people to ensure Maxwell remained buried. The walk through the woods felt different that day. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. I followed the creek as always, but my appreciation for nature had been replaced by hyper-awareness of my surroundings. I reached the designated meeting point and found two people waiting. A man and a woman, both dressed in hiking clothes that helped them blend into the forest. They introduced themselves as part of Diana's security team. They accepted the envelope from me, read its contents, and then gave me verbal instructions to bring back to Maxwell. This became our routine over the next 3 days. My mother would clean the homes of the conspirators, gathering information about their movements and plans. I would carry messages through the woods. Maxwell and Diana would analyze everything, gradually building their case against the partners. On the second day, things became more complicated. My mother was scheduled to clean the Stone Mansion, where Maxwell himself lived. The partners had gathered there to maintain appearances and prepare for their meeting with the military contractors. My mother reported that they were acting as though they were concerned about Maxwell's disappearance, even organizing a search party to look for him. The irony of them searching for a man they had buried alive was not lost on any of us. My mother described how Lawrence Blackwood had stood in Maxwell's office, practicing a speech expressing concern for his missing partner, while actually reviewing documents for the technology sale. The performance had made her stomach turn. That same day, my mother discovered something even more disturbing. While cleaning Eliza Chen's guest house, she overheard a phone conversation that suggested the partners were suspicious about the disturbed grave site in the woods. Someone had reported seeing the empty makeshift coffin. They were now concerned that Maxwell might have somehow escaped. This news sent Maxwell and Diana into intense discussion. Their timeline needed to accelerate. The partners would be more dangerous now, more desperate to complete their deal before Maxwell could reappear and stop them. By the third day, tension filled our small house. Maxwell received word that the military contractors would be arriving that evening for the final signing. Once that happened, the company would effectively be out of his control, and his innovative technology would become a military asset rather than the humanitarian tool he had envisioned. It was then that Maxwell revealed the final phase of his plan. He would need both my mother and me to play crucial roles that evening. My mother would be serving at the dinner preceding the contract signing. I would need to help Diana's team access the mansion through a service entrance that would be less closely monitored. My mother protested immediately. She had agreed to gather information, not to involve me directly in a confrontation with dangerous people. Maxwell assured her that I would remain safely with the security team, away from any potential conflict. My only job would be to show them the service entrance and then wait in a secure location. Despite these assurances, I could see the fear in my mother's eyes. What had seemed like an exciting adventure was revealing itself as something far more dangerous. The people we were working against had already attempted murder once. They would not hesitate to do so again if they felt threatened. As evening approached, my mother dressed for her serving job at the Stone Mansion. Before she left, she held me tightly, making me promise to be careful and to run at the first sign of trouble. I promised, though we both knew I was committed, to seeing this through to the end. Maxwell gave my mother a final briefing. The security team would move in at precisely 9:30. During the dinner, but before the contract signing scheduled for 10. She was to ensure that she was nowhere near the partners when this happened. She would identify herself to the security team by wearing a specific flower pin Maxwell had given her. After my mother left, Maxwell turned to me with a serious expression. He told me it was time for me to guide Diana's team to the service entrance. He reminded me of everything that depended on tonight's success. Justice for his betrayal, a secure future for my mother and me, protection for the water technology that could help millions. I nodded, trying to project confidence I did not entirely feel. As I prepared to leave, Maxwell stopped me. He knelt to my level and looked directly into my eyes. He told me he had never met anyone as brave as I was. He said that whatever happened tonight, he wanted me to know that I had changed his life in ways that went beyond simply saving it. Then he told me something that made all my doubts vanish. He whispered that his partners had not just betrayed him. They had also been responsible for the economic collapse of several small towns like ours through predatory investment practices. Pinewood Hills had been their latest target. They had deliberately driven down property values on the south side, including the area where we lived. They had blocked community development projects that would have created jobs for people like my mother. In other words, they were directly responsible for much of the hardship my family had endured. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This was no longer just about helping Maxwell or securing our future. It was about justice for our entire community. With renewed determination, I set out for the woods one last time. Diana was waiting for me at our usual meeting spot, along with 6 members of her team. They were dressed in dark clothing and carried equipment I did not recognize. Diana assured me they were prepared for any scenario. I led them through the woods to the edge of the stone property. The mansion loomed ahead of us, its windows glowing with light. Cars lined the circular driveway, evidence of the important meeting taking place inside. I pointed out the service entrance at the back of the property, partially hidden by landscaping. Diana thanked me and instructed me to return home immediately. Her tone made it clear this was not a suggestion. I nodded, but had no intention of missing the conclusion of this 3-day drama. Instead of heading home, I circled around to a different section of the property where I knew there was a small decorative shed with windows that offered a view of the main dining room. From my hiding place, I could see the elegantly set dining table where Maxwell's partners entertained their guests. My mother moved efficiently among them, serving food and wine while appearing completely unremarkable. I spotted the flower pin on her lapel, marking her as an ally to Diana's team. At precisely 9:30, the plan was executed with military precision. Diana's team entered through multiple access points simultaneously. The dining room erupted in confusion as security personnel surrounded the table. Through the window, I could see the shocked expressions on the partners' faces as Diana herself entered and announced that she was acting on behalf of Maxwell Stone. What happened next unfolded with startling speed. Diana presented evidence of the partners' conspiracy, including recordings made by my mother and documents Maxwell had secured through his own sources. The military contractors, apparently unwilling to be associated with attempted murder and corporate theft, withdrew immediately. Victor Reynolds made a desperate move, reaching for what I assumed was his concealed weapon. He was quickly subdued by Diana's team. Lawrence Blackwood seemed to collapse in on himself, all his arrogance evaporating in an instant. Eliza Chen alone maintained her composure, though her face had drained of all color. Through it all, my mother continued her role as server, now collecting phones from the stunned conspirators at Diana's instruction. No one looked twice at the quiet cleaning woman who had been invisible to them until now. I was so focused on the scene inside that I failed to notice someone approaching my hiding place until it was too late. A hand clamped over my mouth, stifling. My instinctive scream. I was pulled backward against a solid chest. A familiar voice whispered in my ear, "Maxwell." He asked what I was doing there. I should have been on my way home. I whispered back that I needed to see it through to the end. After a moment, his grip relaxed. He told me I had earned the right to witness justice being served. Together, we watched as police cars arrived, their lights painting the elegant facade of the mansion with flashes of red and blue. The partners were led out in handcuffs, their faces displaying varying degrees of shock, rage, and defeat. As they were placed in separate police vehicles, none of them noticed the two figures watching from the shadows. A millionaire and a 12-year-old girl, the most unlikely allies Pinewood Hills had ever known. When the last police car pulled away, Maxwell turned to me. He said there was one final act to complete tonight. It was time for him to officially return from the dead. He would announce to the world that he had escaped an assassination attempt and had been in hiding while gathering evidence against his would-be killers. He asked if my mother and I would be willing to be acknowledged as the civilians who had helped him. He wanted to publicly thank us for our courage. I hesitated, uncertain how such attention would affect our quiet lives. Maxwell seemed to understand my concern. He offered an alternative. Our involvement could remain anonymous if we preferred. The choice was ours. As we walked back through the woods toward my house, I considered his offer. Part of me wanted recognition for what we had done. Another part, more cautious and mature than my 12 years would suggest, recognized the complications that could arise from such publicity. Maxwell respected my silence, allowing me the space to think. When we reached the edge of the woods, he stopped and turned to me. He told me that regardless of what my mother and I decided about public acknowledgement, his promise to us remained. My education would be fully funded through college and beyond. My mother would never need to clean another house if she chose not to. But then he offered something more, something I had never dared to dream of. He told me that Stone Technologies had a youth science program that identified promising young minds and nurtured their potential. He believed I would be an ideal candidate. If I was interested, I could join the program immediately. It would put me on a path toward becoming the scientist I dreamed of being. I asked if this was charity because he felt sorry for me. His expression grew serious. He told me that he never made business decisions based on emotion. He recognized talent and potential. He invested in both. That was all this was, an investment in the future. My future. As we approached my house, I saw my mother waiting anxiously on the porch. Her face flooded with relief when she saw me. She rushed forward to embrace me, then looked questioningly at Maxwell. He nodded, confirming without words that everything had gone according to plan. The three of us entered our small house, now forever changed by the events of the past 3 days. My mother made tea, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the evening. Maxwell declined her offer of our sofa for another night. Now that his partners were in custody, he could safely return to his own home. Before he left, he asked for our decision about public acknowledgement. My mother and I exchanged a look, having a silent conversation in the way that only people who truly know each other can. She nodded, leaving the final choice to me. I told Maxwell we preferred to remain anonymous. Our involvement would be our secret. He nodded, respecting our decision. He promised that by tomorrow a bank account would be established in my name for educational purposes. Another account would be created for my mother, compensation for her assistance and her silence. As he prepared to leave, Maxwell extended his hand to me. Not as an adult to a child, but as one equal to another. He told me that I had taught him something important over these past few days. I had reminded him why he had created his water purification technology in the first place, to help people like us, people who struggled against systems designed to keep them struggling. He promised that he would redirect Stone Technologies back to its original humanitarian mission. The betrayal he had experienced would not harden his heart or change his vision. If anything, it had reinforced his commitment to using his wealth and influence for positive change. After Maxwell left, my mother and I sat together on our worn sofa. We were physically exhausted but mentally alert, processing everything that had happened. My mother asked if I regretted getting involved in such a dangerous situation. I considered the question carefully before answering. I told her I did not regret it. We had done the right thing, helping someone who needed help and standing against people who had done wrong. But more than that, we had changed our own story. We were no longer just survivors, getting by day to day. We had taken action to shape our future. My mother wrapped her arm around my shoulders and pulled me close. She told me she was proud of me, prouder than she had ever been. Not because we would no longer struggle financially, but because I had shown courage and integrity beyond my years. As we sat together in our small living room, I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. The world was not fair. I had known that for most of my 12 years. But I now understood that unfairness was not immutable. It could be challenged, it could be changed. Sometimes all it took was the courage to dig when others would walk away. The following day, news of Maxwell Stone's miraculous reappearance spread throughout Pinewood Hills. The story dominated local and national headlines. Maxwell gave interviews describing his ordeal without naming my mother or me. He spoke about betrayal and justice, about nearly losing his life and finding a new purpose. True to his word, 2 bank accounts were established, one for my education. That would cover any school I might wish to attend. Another for my mother that contained enough money to allow her to pursue her own dreams rather than merely surviving. But the most significant changes were less tangible. My mother stopped cleaning houses. She enrolled in business courses at the community college, planning to open her own small bakery, something she had dreamed of since before I was born. I joined Stone Technologies' youth science program, working with mentors who nurtured my interest in environmental science and sustainable technology. Maxwell himself became a more frequent presence in our lives, not as a benefactor checking on his investment, but as a friend who genuinely enjoyed our company. He sought my mother's practical wisdom on community matters and my perspective on his youth programs. He valued our input in ways that his wealthy partners never had. 2 weeks after the arrest of his former partners, Maxwell invited us to dinner at his mansion. The same mansion my mother had once cleaned and where the dramatic confrontation had taken place. We dressed in our best clothes, though they were still modest compared to the luxury that surrounded us when we arrived. The staff treated us with the same deference they showed to Maxwell himself. We dined in the elegant room where justice had been served, along with fine wine just nights before. The conversation flowed naturally despite the vast differences in our backgrounds and experiences. After dinner, Maxwell gave us a tour of the mansion, including his personal laboratory where the water purification technology had been developed. He explained the science behind it in terms I could understand, never once talking down to me despite my age. As the evening drew to a close, Maxwell presented each of us with a small box. Inside mine was a compass, far more advanced than my grandfather's but similar in design. Maxwell told me it was to remind me that I had found my true north. My moral compass had guided me to do the right thing even in difficult circumstances. My mother's box contained a key. Maxwell explained it was the key to a small storefront in town that he had purchased. If she still wanted to open her bakery, the space was hers. Not as charity, he emphasized, but as a business investment on which he expected returns. My mother was speechless, tears filling her eyes as the possibility of her dream becoming reality sank in. As we prepared to leave, Maxwell asked for a private word with me. My mother stepped outside, leaving us alone in the grand foyer of the mansion. Maxwell knelt to my eye level, his expression more serious than it had been all evening. He told me that his partners would soon face trial for their crimes. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and they would likely spend many years in prison. Justice would be served through the legal system. But he wondered if that was enough. I asked what he meant. His answer surprised me. He said that legal justice did not always feel complete. The partners had tried to steal his company, his innovation, and his life. They had hurt countless people through their greed. Sometimes, he admitted, he thought about more personal forms, self-retribution. I considered his words carefully. Then I told him something my grandfather used to say before he died. True revenge is not about making others suffer. It is about refusing to let their actions determine your path. The best revenge is creating a life they cannot touch or diminish. Maxwell was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He told me I was wise beyond my years. He promised that he would remember my words when the darker impulses of vengeance tempted him. As my mother and I drove home in the car Maxwell had provided for us, I thought about everything that had happened since that day in the woods. I had saved a man's life. I had helped bring criminals to justice. I had secured a future that once seemed impossible for my family. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that the world was full of buried truths. Some were physical, like a man in a makeshift coffin in the woods. Others were more abstract, like the capacity for courage in a 12-year-old girl, or the strength of character in a woman driven to steal by desperation. The greatest truth I had unearthed was about power. Real power was not about wealth or position. It was about choices. The choice to dig when it would be easier to walk away. The choice to help when it might be dangerous. The choice to forgive when revenge seemed sweeter. As our car turned onto our street, I noticed something different about our neighborhood. The streetlights were all working now. The pavement had been repaired. There were signs of renovation on several houses, small changes that suggested bigger ones to come. My mother noticed my observation and smiled. She told me that Maxwell had established a community development fund for South Pinewood. The first. Projects had already begun. The invisible line that had divided our town was beginning to blur. I realized then that Maxwell had understood something fundamental. The best revenge against those who would bury you is not to climb out of the grave alone. It is to bring others with you, into the light. Emotional aftermath. 6 months passed since the night Maxwell's partners were arrested. Their trial had concluded with guilty verdicts on all counts. Victor Reynolds, Lawrence Blackwood, and Eliza Chen received lengthy prison sentences for attempted murder, conspiracy, and corporate fraud. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law. My life had transformed in ways I could never have imagined. I attended a prestigious science academy while continuing to live at home with my mother. Every day after school, I worked in a special youth lab at Stone Technologies, developing my own small projects under the mentorship of accomplished scientists. My mother's bakery, Sweet Beginnings, had opened 3 months earlier. It had quickly become a favorite gathering place in Pinewood Hills. People from both sides of town came together over her cinnamon rolls and coffee. The invisible boundary between North and South Pinewood was gradually dissolving. Maxwell had kept his promise to redirect his company toward humanitarian goals. The water purification technology was being implemented in developing countries around the world. He had established a foundation that ensured the technology remained accessible to those who needed it most, rather than becoming a luxury for the wealthy or a tool for military purposes. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. The story appeared to have reached its happy ending. But beneath this picture of success and redemption, I struggled with unexpected emotions. Nightmares disrupted my sleep several times each week. In these dreams, I was back in the woods, digging frantically at the disturbed soil. Sometimes I was too late, finding only a corpse in the makeshift coffin. Other times I was the one being buried, gasping for air as dirt covered my face. I became jumpy and suspicious. I startled at unexpected noises. I checked over my shoulder. When walking home from school, I found myself analyzing the motivations of everyone I met, looking for signs of betrayal or deception. The woods I had once loved now filled me with anxiety. I avoided them completely, taking longer routes to reach my destinations. My mother noticed these changes in my behavior. She suggested I speak with someone professional about my experiences. I refused initially, insisting I was fine. I was embarrassed by my fears, seeing them as weakness. After all, I had helped save a man's life and bring criminals to justice. I should feel only pride, not this lingering dread. My mother respected my decision, but watched me with worried eyes. She understood trauma better than I did. Her own life had held its share of difficulties. She recognized the signs of emotional aftermath that I was too young and inexperienced to identify in myself. One evening, as I struggled through homework, unable to concentrate because of intrusive thoughts about the buried coffin, my mother sat beside me. She told me that being brave did not mean being unaffected by frightening experiences. True courage acknowledged fear and moved forward despite it. She shared something she had never told me before. After my father left us, she had experienced panic attacks so severe she could barely function. She had sought help from a community counselor. That decision had not been weakness. It had been necessary for her to continue being the mother I needed. Her words reached through my stubborn resistance. The following week, I began meeting with Dr. Levine, a child psychologist whose services were covered by the health insurance. Maxwell had arranged for us. In our sessions, I gradually opened up about the nightmares, the anxiety, and the hypervigilance that had become my constant companions. Dr. Levine explained that I was experiencing post-traumatic stress, a normal reaction to the abnormal and frightening events I had lived through. She taught me techniques to manage the intrusive memories and calm my nervous system when panic threatened to overwhelm me. During one particularly difficult session, I confessed something I had told no one else. Part of me resented Maxwell for involving me in his dangerous situation. I had saved his life freely, but he had then pulled me into his world of corporate espionage and betrayal. He had shown me the darker side of human nature before I was ready to comprehend it. Dr. Levine helped me understand that these feelings were natural. Gratitude and resentment could coexist. Admiration and anger could share space in my heart. Being honest about these complicated emotions was healthier than denying them. As I worked through these feelings in therapy, I also noticed changes in Maxwell. His public persona remained confident and charismatic. He was celebrated for surviving an assassination attempt and for rededicating his company to humanitarian causes. But in private moments when he visited our home or when I worked in the youth lab, I caught glimpses of a different man. He seemed haunted. There was a wariness in his eyes that had not been there before. He installed elaborate security systems in all his properties. He checked and rechecked facts before making decisions. He kept his circle of trusted associates very small. I recognized these behaviors because they mirrored my own. Maxwell was experiencing his own version of post-traumatic stress. One afternoon, I found him alone in the youth lab, staring at a prototype of the water purification device. He did not notice me at first. His expression was dark, his thoughts clearly far away from the peaceful lab. When he finally sensed my presence, he quickly rearranged his features into the confident smile the world expected from him. I asked if he was okay. His automatic response was affirmative, but then he paused, really looking at me. He seemed to make a decision. He told me that he had been thinking about his former partners, about the fact that people he had trusted for years had been willing to bury him alive for profit. It had shaken his faith in humanity in ways he was still trying to process. It was the first time I had seen Maxwell truly vulnerable, not the powerful businessman or the grateful benefactor, but simply a human being struggling with betrayal and its aftermath. I recognized his pain because it echoed my own. We had both lost something in those woods, a certain innocence, a belief in the fundamental goodness of people. I shared with him some of what I had learned in therapy, about how betrayal creates a wound that needs time and care to heal, about how avoiding the pain only prolongs the suffering. Maxwell listened with genuine interest, not dismissing my insights because of my youth. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for several moments. Then he thanked me for my wisdom. He admitted he had been focused on external justice through the legal system while neglecting the internal healing he needed. He had been so busy rebuilding his company and fulfilling his promises to my mother and me that he had not addressed his own trauma. That conversation marked a turning point for both of us. Maxwell began seeing his own therapist, someone specializing in trauma and betrayal. I continued my sessions with Dr. Levine. We occasionally compared notes on our healing journeys, forming a unique bond through our shared experience and recovery process. 3 months into my therapy, Dr. Levine suggested something that terrified me. She believed it might be healing for me to return to the woods, not alone, but with supporting presence. To reclaim the space that had once brought me joy rather than continuing to avoid it. I resisted initially. The mere thought of walking those familiar paths made my heart race and my palms sweat. But Dr. Levine was patient. She explained how avoidance reinforces fear, how confronting the source of anxiety in a controlled, supported way can diminish its power. After much consideration, I agreed to try. The question was, who should accompany me? My mother was the obvious choice, but I realized there was someone else who needed this healing journey as much as I did. When I suggested to Maxwell that he join me for a walk in the woods, I saw a flash of panic cross his face before he carefully controlled his expression. He asked why I would want to revisit the site of such trauma. I explained Dr. Levine's theory about reclaiming spaces and experiences. I told him I thought it might help both of us. After a long pause, Maxwell agreed. We set a date for the following Saturday morning. When the day arrived, I was nearly sick with anxiety. My mother hugged me tightly before I left, telling me how proud she was of my courage. Maxwell picked me up in his car, his face pale but determined. We drove to the edge of the woods in silence, each lost in our own thoughts and fears. As we began walking along the familiar path, I felt my chest tighten. Maxwell walked beside me, his movements stiff and unnatural. Neither of us spoke. The sound of the creek gradually became audible, its gentle gurgling once a source of peace, now a reminder of that fateful day. When we approached the area where I had found the disturbed soil and the buried coffin, Maxwell stopped abruptly. His breathing had become rapid and shallow. I recognized the signs of panic because I had experienced them myself so often in recent months. I did what Dr. Levine had taught me. I suggested we both take deep breaths, in for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. Maxwell followed my lead without question. Slowly, our breathing synchronized and steadied. The immediate panic receded enough for us to continue. The grave site had changed. Nature had begun to reclaim it. Grass had grown over the disturbed soil. Wildflowers pushed through in scattered patches. There was no visible evidence of the horror that had taken place there. But we both knew. We both remembered. We stood side by side, looking at this ordinary patch of forest floor that had altered the course of our lives. After several minutes of silence, Maxwell spoke. He told me that he still had nightmares about being in that box, the earth heavy above him, the air growing stale. He confessed that he sometimes woke gasping for breath, convinced he was still buried. I admitted my own nightmares. How in mine? I was sometimes the one buried, sometimes the one too late to save him. How the woods had transformed in my mind from a sanctuary to a place of danger. Maxwell listened without interruption, giving me space to express what I had, kept hidden from almost everyone else. When I finished, Maxwell did something unexpected. He knelt and touched the earth where his grave had been. His hand trembled slightly, but his voice was steady when he spoke. He said this place represented the worst and best of humanity, the worst in those who had tried to murder him for profit, the best in a 12-year-old girl who had saved a stranger's life without hesitation. He told me that he had been focusing too much on the betrayal and not enough on the rescue, on the darkness rather than the light. As he spoke, I realized I had been doing the same. The nightmares featured the coffin, the burial, the desperation. They rarely included the moment of successful rescue, the victory of life over death. Maxwell stood, brushing dirt from his hand. He suggested we continue our walk, following the creek as I used to do before that day. I hesitated, but then agreed. Step by step, we reclaimed the path. We noted birds singing overhead. We spotted a deer watching us cautiously from a distance. We pointed out interesting rocks and plants to each other. By the time we completed our circuit and returned to the car, something had shifted. The woods would never again be the carefree place of my childhood explorations, but neither would they remain the terrifying landscape of my nightmares. They had become something in between, a complex place holding both darkness and light, danger and beauty. That evening, I slept without nightmares for the first time in months. The walk had not magically cured my anxiety or erased the trauma, but it had begun a process of integration, of accepting what had happened as part of my story rather than defining my entire existence. In my next session with Dr. Levine, I described the experience in detail. She pointed out something I had not fully recognized. By suggesting the walk and guiding Maxwell through his panic, I had taken back control. I was no longer simply reacting to what had happened to me. I was actively participating in my own healing and helping someone else with theirs. This realization marked another turning point. I began to see myself not as a victim of circumstances or even just a survivor, but as someone with agency and wisdom born from difficult experience. The trauma had changed me, yes, but not all change is damage. Some is growth, painful though it may be. As spring turned to summer, almost a year after finding Maxwell in the woods, I felt strong enough to make an important decision. I asked to attend the sentencing hearing for Victor Reynolds, the most aggressive of the three partners, and the one who had originally suggested burying Maxwell alive rather than simply killing him quickly. Maxwell was surprised by my request. He asked if I was certain this would be helpful rather than harmful to my recovery. I explained that I needed to see justice completed, to witness the consequences of the actions that had so profoundly affected my life. After consulting with Dr. Levine, who supported my decision with certain preparations, Maxwell arranged for me to attend. The courtroom was intimidating with its formal procedures and somber atmosphere. I sat beside Maxwell, my mother, on my other side. When Victor was brought in, I was struck by how ordinary he looked. In my mind, he had become a monster, larger than life in his capacity for evil. In reality, he was just a man, diminished by his prison jumpsuit and the weight of his crimes. As the judge delivered the sentence, 25 years without possibility of parole, I watched Victor's face carefully. I saw shock give way to anger and finally to a resigned despair. In that moment, I felt an unexpected emotion. Not satisfaction or vindication, but pity. This man had thrown away his freedom, his reputation, his entire life for money he would never get to enjoy. After the sentencing, as we left the courthouse, a reporter approached and asked how I felt about the verdict. Maxwell moved to shield me from the question, but I decided to answer. I said that justice had been served, but there were no winners today. Everyone involved had lost something. Some had lost their freedom, others had lost their sense of security or innocence. The best we could do now was to create something meaningful from what remained. My response was quoted in several newspapers the following day. It brought renewed attention to my role in saving Maxwell and helping bring his would-be killers to justice. People began to recognize me on the street. Strangers approached to express their admiration or ask intrusive questions about the experience. This unexpected fame created a new challenge. I had been working through the trauma in private, at my own pace. Now I was being asked to revisit it constantly for the benefit of curious strangers. Dr. Levine helped me develop strategies for maintaining boundaries while acknowledging the public interest in what had happened. Maxwell also struggled with the renewed attention. The sentencing had brought the entire ordeal back into the headlines. Journalists speculated about the psychological impact of being buried alive. Business analysts discussed the future of stone technologies now that the legal proceedings had concluded. Security experts debated the measures Maxwell should take to prevent future attempts on his life. Through it all, Maxwell maintained his public composure. But in private moments, he confessed to me that he was tired of being defined by the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He wanted to be known for his innovations and humanitarian work, not forever labeled as the millionaire who survived being buried alive. I understood his frustration because I felt the same way. I was more than the girl who had dug up a buried millionaire. I was a student with dreams of becoming an environmental scientist. I was a daughter, a friend, a person with interests and aspirations that had nothing to do with that day in the woods. Together, Maxwell and I made a pact. We would acknowledge our shared history when necessary, but refuse to be defined by it. We would focus on building our futures rather than reliving our past. We would transform our trauma into purpose, using what we had learned about human nature, both its darkness and its light, to create positive change. As the one-year anniversary of that fateful day approached, Maxwell proposed an idea that seemed counterintuitive, but ultimately proved healing. He suggested we hold a small ceremony at the grave site, not to commemorate the trauma, but to celebrate its transformation, to mark how far we had come in our recovery, and to formally close that chapter of our lives. Dr. Levine approved of the plan with certain conditions. The ceremony should be private, limited to those directly involved. It should include a ritual of release or transformation, and it should focus more on the future than the past. On the anniversary day, a small group gathered in the woods. Maxwell and I, my mother, Diana, whose security team had helped bring the partners to justice, Dr. Levine, who had guided my healing journey, Maxwell's therapist, who had done the same. For him, we formed a circle around the spot where the grave had been. The area was now completely reclaimed by nature, with no visible evidence of what had occurred there. Maxwell had brought a small tree to plant, a symbol of new life emerging from dark soil. As we took turns digging a hole for the sapling, each person spoke briefly about growth and renewal, about how darkness can become light, about how endings can become beginnings. The simple ritual brought tears, but also laughter, a release of emotion that felt cleansing rather than painful. When the tree was planted and watered, Maxwell produced a small metal box. He explained that he had written down his lingering fears and regrets on a piece of paper. He invited each of us to do the same with whatever emotions we were ready to release. We would bury the box beside the tree, symbolically laying our trauma to rest. I wrote about my nightmares, about the hypervigilance that still occasionally gripped me, about the way my childhood had ended more abruptly than it should have. As I placed my paper in the box, I felt a weight lifting, not completely, but noticeably. Once the box was buried, we stood in silence for a moment. Then Maxwell spoke words that resonated deeply with everyone present. He said that some experiences mark us forever, changing the landscape of our lives in ways both painful and profound. We cannot go back to who we were before, but we can choose what to build on the altered terrain. He thanked me again for saving his life that day, for having the courage to dig when others would have turned away. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring that my courage was rewarded, not just through financial support or educational opportunities, but by living a life worthy of being saved. As we walked back through the woods together, I realized something important. The path looked the same as it always had. The trees, the creek, the dappled sunlight filtering through leaves. What had changed was not the woods, but how I perceived them. They now held both terrible and wonderful memories, both trauma and healing, both an ending and a beginning. In that moment, I knew I had reached a turning point in my recovery. The experience would always be part of me, a chapter in my story that could not be erased, but it would no longer be the main plot of my life. It would become background, context, for the person I was becoming rather than the defining event of my existence. As we emerged from the woods into sunlight, I felt ready to move forward, not by forgetting what had happened, but by integrating it into a larger narrative. A narrative that included not just survival but growth, not just justice but transformation, not just revenge but something far more powerful. Renewal, revenge planning. 2 years passed since that day in the woods. I was 14 now, in my second year at the Science Academy. My mother's bakery had expanded to a second location in a neighboring town. Maxwell had fully restored stone technologies to its humanitarian mission, implementing the water purification systems in countries around the world. Life had settled into a new normal. My therapy sessions with Dr. Levine had reduced to monthly check-ins rather than weekly necessity. The nightmares had become rare occurrences rather than regular torments. Maxwell had become a fixture in our lives, a mentor to me and a business partner to my mother, whose baking creations were now featured at all Stone Technologies events. On the surface, it seemed the story had reached its natural conclusion. Justice had been served, healing had progressed, life had moved forward. But fate had one more twist in store, one that would test everything I had learned about justice, revenge, and the fine line between them. The revelation came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was in the youth lab at Stone Technologies, working on a science project analyzing water samples from the creek in the woods. I had finally reclaimed this place that had once brought me such joy, using my painful experience as motivation to understand and protect natural resources. Maxwell entered the lab, his expression troubled in a way I had not seen since the trial. He asked if I could take a break from my work. There was something important he needed to discuss with me. Alarmed by his serious tone, I immediately set aside my project and followed him to his private office. Once the door closed behind us, Maxwell gestured for me to sit. He paced for a moment, clearly struggling with what he needed to say. Finally, he told me that he had received disturbing news. Victor Reynolds, the partner who had been most directly responsible for the murder attempt, had managed to continue his criminal activities from prison. Using connections and money that had remained hidden during the trial, Victor had been orchestrating a campaign of revenge against Maxwell, and by extension, against my mother and me. He had hired people to investigate our lives, looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit. His ultimate goal appeared to be destroying everything Maxwell had rebuilt and everyone who had helped him. The information had come from Diana, whose security team had intercepted communications between Victor and his associates on the outside. They had discovered that Victor's network was more extensive than anyone had realized. He had connections to corrupt officials, unscrupulous business competitors, and even organized crime figures willing to do his bidding for the right price. Most disturbing of all, Diana had found evidence that Victor knew about my role in saving Maxwell. He knew where I went to school. He knew about my mother's bakery. He knew details of our lives that should have remained private, and he had made explicit threats against us in his communications. Maxwell assured me that Diana had already enhanced security around our home, my school, and my mother's business. We were not in immediate danger, but the threat was real and growing. Victor had nothing left to lose. His hatred had festered during his 2 years in prison, becoming an obsession with destroying those he blamed for his downfall. I sat in stunned silence as Maxwell explained the situation. The fear I had worked so hard to overcome came rushing back. The hypervigilance, the sense of being watched, the dread of what might happen next. But there was something else too. Simmering anger that this man who had already taken so much from us was now threatening our hard-won peace. Maxwell must have seen these emotions crossing my face. He leaned forward, his expression intense. He told me that he had been debating whether to share this information with me at all. Part of him had wanted to handle it quietly, to shield me from further trauma. But he had realized that would be disrespectful of my strength and everything I had overcome. He explained that Diana had presented him with several options for dealing with Victor's threats. The most obvious was legal action. They could take the evidence to the authorities, potentially adding years to Victor's sentence and restricting his communications. But given his connections to corrupt officials, there was no guarantee this would solve the problem. Another option was to fight fire with fire, to use Maxwell's considerable resources to destroy what remained of Victor's hidden assets and sever his outside connections. This approach would be more direct, but would require operating in ethical gray areas that Maxwell was reluctant to enter. The final option was the most radical: to arrange for Victor to be transferred to a maximum security facility where his ability to communicate with the outside world would be severely limited. This would require significant political influence and financial investment, essentially buying the cooperation of prison officials and politicians with the power to approve such a transfer. Maxwell wanted my input, not because he expected a 14-year-old to make these decisions, but because any course of action would affect my life and my mother's. He believed I had earned the right to be part of the conversation. I asked what he thought was the best approach. Maxwell sighed, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of uncertainty. He admitted that the legal route was cleanest, but potentially least effective. The aggressive approach of dismantling Victor's network might work, but would require actions Maxwell was not comfortable taking. The transfer option was most likely to succeed, but would involve compromising principles Maxwell had fought to maintain. As I considered these options, I remembered something Dr. Levine had often emphasized in our sessions: the difference between justice and revenge. Justice was about restoring balance, ensuring consequences matched actions, and preventing further harm. Revenge was about inflicting suffering, often at the cost of one's own moral principles. I asked Maxwell a simple but essential question: was his goal to punish Victor or to protect us? Without hesitation, he answered that protection was his only concern. Victor had already received his legal punishment. This was about ensuring he could not cause further harm from behind bars. That clarified things for me. I told Maxwell that I believed we needed to find a solution that would be effective without compromising who we were or what we stood for. Those were the very values Victor was attacking. If we abandoned them in our defense, he would achieve a victory even from his prison cell. Maxwell nodded, a small smile breaking through his worry. He said that my perspective reminded him of why he had come to trust me so completely. Even at 14, I could see the heart of a complex situation. Together, we began to formulate a different approach. Rather than working against the legal system or trying to manipulate it with money and influence, we would work with it. We would gather evidence of Victor's continued criminal activities in a transparent, legitimate way. We would identify the corrupt officials enabling his outside communications and expose them through proper channels. Most importantly, we would address the root of the problem. Victor's obsession with revenge was fueled by his belief that he had been uniquely victimized by Maxwell. He saw himself as a wronged party rather than a failed murderer. This distorted perspective gave his hatred its power. Maxwell was skeptical of my suggestion that we could change Victor's perspective. People like Victor rarely experience genuine remorse or empathy, but I argued that we did not need to reform him. We only needed to redirect his focus away from us. Over the next several days, Maxwell, Diana, my mother, and I refined our plan. It was neither purely defensive nor aggressively offensive. It was strategic, designed to neutralize the threat while maintaining our integrity. And it hinged on something unexpected: the truth. Diana's team would continue gathering evidence of Victor's criminal network. This would be compiled meticulously, with every connection documented and every corrupt official identified. Rather than using this information in secretive ways, we would prepare it for submission to federal authorities rather than local ones, who might be compromised. Meanwhile, Maxwell would use his media connections to publicly acknowledge the ongoing threat from Victor, not in a way that centered Maxwell as a victim, but in a way that exposed Victor's actions to public scrutiny. The narrative would not be about a millionaire fearing for his safety, but about a convicted criminal continuing to harm society from behind bars. My mother would secure her bakery and our home with additional security measures, but otherwise maintain our normal routines. Showing fear would only encourage Victor. Continuing our lives demonstrated that his power over us was limited. My role was perhaps the most unusual. With Dr. Levine's guidance and support, I would write a letter to Victor. Not a plea or an accusation, but a simple statement of facts. I would tell him what his actions had cost me: the nightmares, the therapy sessions, the loss of innocence. I would not ask for his remorse or forgiveness. I would simply ensure he understood the human impact of what he had done. Dr. Levine had suggested this approach based on research showing that perpetrators often depersonalized their victims. They saw them as symbols rather than humans with feelings and lives. My letter would force Victor to confront me as a real person, not just a faceless entity who had helped thwart his plans. As we prepared to implement this multifaceted strategy, I struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of me was terrified that engaging with Victor in any way would only intensify his focus on us. Another part was angry that we had to devote so much energy to a man who should have no power over our lives. Yet another part felt a grim satisfaction in actively confronting the threat rather than simply hoping it would disappear. Dr. Levine helped me navigate these feelings during extra sessions scheduled to support me through this stressful period. She reminded me that fear was a natural response to danger, but should not be the basis for decision-making. Anger was legitimate, but needed to be channeled constructively, and taking action to protect oneself was not the same as seeking revenge. The most difficult part of our plan was my letter to Victor. I wrote draft after draft, struggling to find the right tone. Some versions came out too emotional, others too detached. Some read like accusations, others like pleas. None felt right until Dr. Levine suggested a simple approach. Write it as if I were documenting scientific observations. Describe the effects of his actions with the same clarity and precision I would use to describe the results of an experiment. The final version was 3 pages long. It began with a factual account of finding Maxwell buried in the woods. It continued with a detailed description of the psychological impact this experience had on me, the frequency and content of nightmares, the number of therapy sessions required, the specific ways my daily life had changed, the quantifiable costs in time. emotional energy, and developmental milestones. I concluded not with accusations or threats, but with a simple statement. I was 14 years old. I had decades of life ahead of me. I had chosen not to allow his actions to define that life. I was moving forward, creating a future based on my own values and aspirations rather than in reaction to his cruelty. His continued attempts to harm us would not change that fundamental reality. Dr. Levine reviewed the letter carefully before approving it. She believed it struck the right balance between personal impact and emotional boundaries. It made clear that Victor's actions had real consequences, while establishing that his power over me was limited by my own choices and resilience. While I worked on my letter, Diana's team assembled their evidence of Victor's criminal network. They identified 3 prison officials who had been facilitating his communications for financial gain. They traced money from hidden accounts to associates on the outside who were gathering information about Maxwell, my mother, and me. They documented explicit threats made against us in these communications. Maxwell, meanwhile, prepared a press statement about the situation. Rather than portraying himself as a victim seeking sympathy, he framed the issue as a matter of public safety and institutional integrity. He emphasized that a convicted criminal was continuing to operate as if he were free, highlighting the corruption that made this possible. He presented himself not as someone seeking protection, but as a citizen concerned about systemic failures. My mother took a different approach. She increased security at both bakery locations without drawing attention to the reasons. She adjusted our home security system with similar discretion. But her most significant action was reaching out to our community. Without sharing specific details about the threat, she strengthened our network of neighbors, friends, and business associates. She operated on the principle that isolation increases vulnerability, while connection provides protection. As all elements of our plan came together, Maxwell called a meeting at his home. Diana presented her completed file of evidence, ready for submission to federal authorities. Maxwell reviewed his media strategy, designed to shine light on Victor's activities without creating panic. My mother reported on the community connections she had reinforced, and I presented my finished letter, now in a sealed envelope addressed to Victor Reynolds. The atmosphere was solemn but resolute. We were not acting out of fear or seeking revenge. We were methodically addressing a threat in a way that aligned with our values. There was a certain power in this approach, a clarity of purpose that felt right despite the circumstances that had necessitated it. The plan was set in motion the following day. Diana delivered the evidence file to trusted contacts in federal law enforcement. Maxwell released his carefully crafted statement to selected media outlets. My mother activated her network of community support, and my letter was sent to Victor through official channels, with copies provided to prison authorities and his legal representatives to ensure it reached him. The days that followed were tense. We did not expect immediate results, but the waiting was difficult nonetheless. I found myself checking over my shoulder more frequently, startling at unexpected noises, experiencing echoes of the hypervigilance I had worked so hard to overcome. Dr. Levine reminded me that these were normal responses to a real threat. The difference now was that I had tools to manage these reactions and a support system to help me through this challenging time. 1 week after implementing our plan, the first results became apparent. Federal agents arrested 2 prison officials identified in Diana's evidence file. The third was cooperating with authorities, providing additional information about Victor's network in exchange for leniency. Maxwell's media statement had generated significant public interest, leading to calls for an investigation into prison, communication systems, and oversight procedures. 2 associates of Victor were taken into custody while surveilling my mother's bakery, evidence that our concerns had been well-founded. Their arrest led to the discovery of detailed plans to vandalize the business and potentially harm employees. My mother's enhanced security measures had likely prevented a serious incident. As for my letter, we had no way of knowing Victor's immediate reaction, but his legal representatives contacted Maxwell to indicate their client was willing to discuss a formal agreement to cease all activities against us in exchange for certain considerations. This suggested the letter had at least gotten his attention, perhaps even destabilized his certainty about his course of action. Maxwell was skeptical of this overture. Victor had demonstrated his untrustworthiness too many times to be taken at his word. But Diana suggested we explore the possibility while maintaining all our other protective measures. Understanding Victor's current thinking could provide valuable insight, even if no agreement was ultimately reached. After consulting with my mother and me, Maxwell agreed to a carefully structured negotiation. Victor's representatives would meet with Maxwell's legal team at a neutral location. The discussion would focus on specific, verifiable actions Victor would take to demonstrate his commitment to ending his campaign against us. In return, Maxwell would consider supporting certain improvements in Victor's prison conditions, though nothing that would enhance his ability to communicate with the outside world. I was not present for these negotiations, but Maxwell provided a detailed account afterward. Victor's representatives had presented a list of demands that were initially unreasonable, including financial compensation and assistance with a potential appeal. Maxwell's team had firmly rejected these, while remaining open to more limited accommodations. After several hours of discussion, a tentative framework emerged. Victor would provide a complete accounting of his hidden assets and criminal connections. He would sign legally binding documents, committing to no further action against Maxwell or anyone associated with him. In return, Maxwell would support Victor's transfer to a facility with better rehabilitation programs, though still with appropriate security measures. Most significantly from my perspective, Victor had asked to respond to my letter, not directly to me but through the same official channels I had used. Maxwell had agreed to this with the condition that any response would be reviewed by Dr. Levine before I saw it, to ensure it contained nothing manipulative or harmful. The negotiations continued for several weeks, with federal authorities now involved, to ensure any agreement would not interfere with ongoing criminal investigations. During this time, Diana's team maintained their vigilance around our safety. My mother and I continued our normal routines, though with heightened awareness of our surroundings. Then, nearly 2 months after sending my letter, a response from Victor arrived. As agreed, Dr. Levine reviewed it first. She called a special session to discuss it with me, explaining that while the letter contained nothing overtly threatening, it was complex in ways that warranted careful consideration. When she finally handed me Victor's letter, I was struck first by its length. Over 10 pages, written in a cramped hand that filled every available space. The content was even more surprising. It began not with denial or justification, but with a stark admission. He acknowledged burying Maxwell alive. He acknowledged the trauma this would cause anyone who discovered such a scene, especially a child. He did not apologize, but he recognized the reality of what he had done. The letter continued with Victor's perspective on the events leading to his crime. His version differed significantly from Maxwell's, painting himself as the true innovator behind Stone Technologies, who had been gradually sidelined as the company grew. He described feeling betrayed by Maxwell's humanitarian focus, which he saw as naive idealism that wasted the true potential of their innovations. These justifications were self-serving and distorted, revealing a man unable to recognize his own moral failings, but there was something almost pitiful in his desperate attempt to reframe his attempted murder as a reasonable response to perceived wrongs. As Dr. Levine had suggested, Victor had constructed a narrative in which he was the victim rather than the perpetrator. The final pages addressed me more directly. Victor expressed surprise at the clinical detail of my letter, noting that it differed from the emotional appeal he had expected. He admitted that he had not considered the impact of his actions on someone uninvolved in his conflict with Maxwell. He had seen me merely as an obstacle to his plans rather than as a person whose life he had altered. Most revealing was his closing statement. He wrote that he had spent 2 years in prison fantasizing about revenge against Maxwell. The fantasy had sustained him through the monotony and humiliation of incarceration. But my letter and the federal investigation had forced him to confront a reality he had been avoiding. His obsession with revenge had cost him everything while giving him nothing in return. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not promise redemption. But he did offer a proposal. He would provide complete information about his remaining assets and criminal connections, sealing every avenue he had been using to threaten us from prison. In return, he asked only that Maxwell support his transfer to a facility with better mental health services. Dr. Levine helped me process my reactions to this unexpected response. I felt confusion at its complexity, skepticism about its sincerity, but also a strange sense of closure. Victor was acknowledging his actions and their impact in a way he had never done before. Whether this represented genuine insight or merely strategic calculation was impossible to determine, but either way it suggested our approach had been effective. I shared the letter with Maxwell and my mother, along with Dr. Levine's assessment. Maxwell was cautiously optimistic. If Victor followed through on his offer to disclose his remaining assets and connections, it would effectively neutralize the threat he posed. The requested transfer to a facility with better mental health services aligned with our goal of addressing the root of the problem rather than merely containing its symptoms. My mother was more reserved in her response. She had seen firsthand the detailed plans Victor's associates had made to damage her business and potentially harm her employees. A letter, however seemingly insightful, could not easily overcome that evidence of malicious intent. She would need to see concrete actions before believing in any change of heart. After careful consideration and further consultation with Diana's security team, we decided to proceed cautiously with Victor's proposal. Maxwell would support the transfer request if Victor first provided the promised information about his assets and connections. Federal authorities would verify this information before any further steps were taken. Over the next month, Victor cooperated with investigators to an extent that surprised everyone involved. He disclosed hidden accounts in offshore banks. He identified corrupt officials who had been facilitating his communications. He provided names and contact methods for associates still carrying out his instructions on the outside. Each disclosure was carefully verified by federal authorities. Each revealed connection was investigated and, where appropriate, prosecuted. Victor's network, which had taken years to build and had continued to operate despite his imprisonment, was systematically dismantled. As evidence of his cooperation accumulated, Maxwell fulfilled his part of the agreement. He supported Victor's request for transfer to a facility known for its psychiatric and rehabilitation programs. The transfer was approved with conditions ensuring Victor would have appropriate mental health support while still limiting his ability to communicate with the outside world. Before the transfer took place, Victor made one final request. He asked to meet with Maxwell in person, not with me or my mother, only with Maxwell. After consulting with security experts and psychologists, Maxwell agreed to a carefully controlled meeting at the prison. I was not present, of course, but Maxwell described the encounter afterward. Victor had aged dramatically in prison, his once imposing presence diminished by confinement and the collapse of his schemes. The two former partners, once friends and then mortal enemies, sat across from each other in a visitor's room under the watchful eyes of guards. According to Maxwell, Victor had asked why Maxwell had not simply killed him when he had the chance. After the grave in the woods, after the arrest, after discovering the continued threats from prison, Maxwell had possessed the resources and connections to arrange an accident that would have permanently ended the danger Victor posed. Maxwell's answer had been simple. Killing Victor would have meant becoming like him, choosing revenge over justice, allowing fear and hatred to determine his actions rather than his principles. Maxwell had not spared Victor out of mercy or forgiveness, but out of commitment to his own moral standards. Victor had seemed genuinely puzzled by this response. In his worldview, power existed to be used against enemies. Restraint was weakness, not strength. Yet he had grudgingly acknowledged that Maxwell's approach had ultimately proven more effective than his own. Maxwell remained free, successful, and respected. Victor had lost everything in his pursuit of revenge. The meeting had ended with no reconciliation, no emotional catharsis. Just two men acknowledging the reality of their current circumstances and the choices that had led them there. Maxwell had left feeling not vindicated or triumphant, but simply certain that he had chosen the right path. As for me, I received no further communication from Victor. His transfer to the new facility proceeded as planned. Reports indicated he was participating in required psychiatric treatment and had ceased all attempts to communicate with outside associates. The threat he had posed to our family gradually receded from immediate danger to historical fact. Diana's security team maintained enhanced monitoring for several more months, gradually reducing their presence, as evidence mounted that Victor's network had been truly neutralized. My mother's bakeries continued to thrive without further incidents. My education at the Science Academy progressed uninterrupted. In therapy sessions with Dr. Levine, I worked through my complex feelings about the entire situation, relief that the threat had been addressed, lingering anxiety that took time to subside, periodic anger at having had to devote so much energy, to dealing with Victor's malice, and a growing pride in how we had handled the situation. We had not sought revenge. We had not compromised our principles for expediency. We had faced the threat directly but proportionately. We had chosen a path that protected us while maintaining our integrity. And perhaps most importantly, we had refused to allow Victor's hatred to infect us or define our actions. As the immediate crisis faded into the past, I found myself reflecting on what I had learned through this experience, about the difference between justice and revenge, about the power of truth as a strategic tool, about the importance of addressing root causes rather than just symptoms, about the strength that comes from maintaining one's principles even in frightening circumstances. These lessons would shape my understanding of conflict resolution for years to come. They would influence my approach to scientific ethics as I pursued my education. They would inform my perspective on social justice as I became more engaged with issues beyond my personal experience. They would become foundational principles rather than mere reactions to a specific threat. In the end, our response to Victor's campaign of revenge became something neither he nor we could have anticipated. Not a counterattack or a surrender, but a transformation. We had taken his malice and converted it into an opportunity for growth, clarity, and reaffirmation of our values. This was perhaps the most powerful form of victory, not defeating an enemy, but refusing to become like him even when threatened. Not seeking his destruction, but maintaining our own integrity. Not responding to hatred, but with strategic wisdom and unwavering principles. And for a 14-year-old girl who had once dug a man from a grave in the woods, this lesson in the true nature of power and justice would prove more valuable than any revenge could ever be. The revenge 3 years passed. I was 17 now, in my final year at the Science Academy and preparing for college. My mother's bakery business had expanded to 4 locations across the state. Maxwell had transformed Stone Technologies into a global leader in environmental innovation, with the water purification system now serving millions in developing countries. Victor Reynolds remained in the psychiatric facility where he had been transferred. Reports indicated he was complying with treatment protocols and had ceased all attempts to communicate with former associates. The threat he had posed seemed firmly confined to our past rather than our present or future. Life had moved forward in ways that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. I maintained a rigorous academic schedule while participating in Stone Technologies' youth innovation programs. My mother had become known for both her business acumen and her community activism. Maxwell had rebuilt his company according to his original humanitarian vision, more successful than ever. From the outside, it appeared we had overcome our difficult history and created lives defined by our own choices rather than by trauma or fear. And in many ways, this was true. The nightmares that had once plagued me now came rarely, if ever. My therapy sessions with Dr. Levine had reduced to occasional check-ins. My mother no longer startled at unexpected noises or checked the security system multiple times each night. But as the 3rd anniversary of Victor's transfer approached, a new development shattered our hard-won sense of security. It began with a phone call from Diana, who remained head of security for Stone Technologies. Her team had detected unusual activity in dormant accounts once connected to Victor's network. Someone was accessing funds that had remained hidden during the original investigation. Initially, this seemed like a routine security matter. Perhaps a former associate of Victor had discovered access information and was attempting to steal remaining assets. Diana's team would identify the individual, notify authorities, and the situation would be resolved without direct impact on our lives. But as the investigation progressed, a more disturbing pattern emerged. The accessed funds were being used in very specific ways to purchase property near my mother's newest bakery location. To establish a scholarship fund at the university, I planned to attend the following year, to invest in companies competing with Stone Technologies in the water purification sector. These were not random financial transactions. They represented a coordinated strategy targeting the three of us, using methods subtle enough to avoid triggering immediate alarms, but clear enough in their intent when viewed collectively. Someone was positioning themselves in close proximity to our lives and interests. The question was who, and to what purpose. Diana's investigation eventually identified the individual behind these activities, Martin Frost, Victor's former personal assistant, a man who had avoided prosecution during the original case by providing evidence against his employer. He had been considered a minor figure, someone following orders rather than making decisions. After testifying, he had disappeared from public view, presumably to rebuild his life away from the scandal. But now it appeared Martin had maintained his loyalty to Victor, despite the apparent betrayal. He had waited patiently for years, keeping a low profile while positioning himself to act on some long-term plan. The timing, 3 years after Victor's transfer, suggested a pre-arranged schedule rather than a spontaneous decision. Maxwell called, an urgent meeting at his home when these facts became clear. Diana presented her findings with clinical precision, the dormant accounts now active, the strategic nature of the transactions. Martin's careful movements to establish himself near each of us, without direct contact. The evidence suggesting a long-term plan now entering its active phase. My mother listened with growing concern, the hard-won peace of recent years visibly eroding as she absorbed this new threat. I felt the familiar sensation of hypervigilance returning, my attention jumping to small noises, my muscles tensing as if preparing for immediate danger. Dr. Levine, who had been invited to provide psychological perspective, observed our reactions with professional concern. When Diana finished her presentation, Maxwell asked the critical question, what was Martin's ultimate objective? The financial transactions themselves caused no direct harm. The proximity he was establishing had not yet translated into threatening actions. Was this merely surveillance, preparation for something more sinister, or an elaborate form of psychological torture designed to remind us that Victor's influence could still reach us despite his confinement? Diana admitted she could not determine intent with certainty. Martin had been careful to keep his activities just within legal boundaries. The property purchase near my mother's bakery was a legitimate business investment. The scholarship fund at my prospective university was philanthropically sound on paper. The investments in Stone Technologies' competitors represented normal market activity. Only when viewed together, with knowledge of Martin's connection to Victor, did these actions reveal their likely malicious intent. But intent alone was not actionable from a legal perspective. Until Martin crossed a clear line, authorities would have limited grounds to intervene. Dr. Levine offered her professional assessment. Whether Martin intended physical harm or merely psychological distress, his actions were clearly designed to disrupt our sense of security, to remind us of vulnerability just as we had begun to feel truly safe, to reinsert Victor's presence into our lives indirectly since he could no longer reach us directly. My mother asked the practical question, what could we do to protect ourselves? Diana outlined standard security enhancements, additional monitoring of Martin's activities, preemptive conversations with local authorities about our concerns. Physical. Security assessments at our homes, workplaces, and schools. These were necessary precautions, but they felt inadequate against the subtle nature of the threat. Martin was not making explicit threats or taking clearly illegal actions. He was creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and potential danger without crossing lines that would trigger immediate intervention. As the discussion continued, I found myself thinking about our previous experience with Victor, about the approach we had taken then, addressing the root of the threat rather than merely defending against its symptoms, about the power of direct, engagement rather than passive protection, about the strategic use of truth as both shield and sword. I asked for permission to speak, aware that as the youngest person present, my perspective might be dismissed as naive or impulsive. But Maxwell nodded encouragingly, and the others fell silent, waiting for my thoughts. I suggested that defensive measures alone would leave us perpetually responding to Martin's actions rather than taking control of the situation. Instead, we should consider a more proactive approach, not one based on fear or retaliation, but on strategic clarity and the power of direct confrontation. My proposal was simple in concept, though complex in execution. Rather than hiding from Martin's maneuvering, we would acknowledge it openly. Maxwell would contact him directly, not with threats or accusations, but with an invitation to meet, to discuss whatever grievances or objectives were driving his actions, to address the situation directly, rather than allowing it to fester in shadows and implications. This approach would accomplish several things simultaneously. It would signal to Martin that his activities had been detected, removing the advantage of presumed secrecy. It would provide an opportunity to assess his intentions more accurately through direct interaction, and most importantly, it would shift the dynamic from his orchestration to our initiative. Dr. Levine expressed concern about potential psychological impact, particularly on me. Was I prepared to face another manifestation of the trauma that had taken years to process? Would direct engagement with Martin risk undoing the progress I had made in therapy? These were legitimate questions that required honest assessment. I acknowledged the risks, but argued that living under the shadow of Martin's undefined threat would ultimately cause more psychological harm than confronting it directly. Fear feeds on uncertainty. By bringing the situation into the open, we would reduce its power to generate anxiety and hypervigilance. Maxwell considered my suggestion carefully. He asked Diana about security implications. Could such a meeting be arranged with adequate protection? Diana confirmed that with proper planning and location selection, the physical risks could be effectively managed. Martin had no history of violence himself, having served Victor primarily in administrative and financial capacities. My mother was harder to convince. Her protective instincts resisted any approach that might bring me closer to potential danger, but she had also witnessed my growth and resilience over the years. She knew that treating me as someone to be sheltered, rather than an active participant in addressing threats to our family, would undermine the independence she had worked so hard to foster. After extensive discussion, a consensus emerged. Maxwell would contact Martin with a carefully worded message, acknowledging awareness of his recent activities, expressing willingness to discuss whatever issues he wished to address, proposing a meeting at a neutral location with appropriate security measures. The message would be polite but direct, professional rather than threatening or accusatory. I would not attend this initial meeting. That was the compromise that secured my mother's agreement to the plan. Maxwell would represent our collective interests, with Diana providing security and Dr. Levine advising on psychological aspects of the interaction. Depending on what was learned from this first contact, we would determine next steps together. Maxwell sent the message the following day through formal business channels, addressing Martin as a professional courtesy would dictate. The response came within hours, suggesting Martin had been anticipating some form of contact. He agreed to the meeting with one condition. It must include all three of us, Maxwell, my mother, and me. This demand created immediate concern. Diana opposed it on security grounds. Dr. Levine questioned the psychological wisdom of placing me in direct contact with someone connected to my original trauma. My mother refused outright to consider my participation. Even Maxwell, who had supported my more active role in addressing the situation, hesitated at directly involving me in a face-to-face meeting with Martin. But as we discussed alternative approaches, I became increasingly convinced that Martin's condition was itself revealing. He wanted all three of us present because his plan, whatever it was, involved all three of us. Sending Maxwell alone would likely result in a non-productive interaction, with Martin revealing little of substance. After consulting privately with Dr. Levine about my readiness for such an encounter, I presented my case to the group. I was no longer the traumatized 12-year-old who had discovered Maxwell buried in the woods. I was 17, academically accomplished, psychologically resilient, and fully capable of participating in this discussion. Moreover, I argued, my presence might reveal aspects of Martin's intentions that would remain hidden if I were absent. My mother remained resistant, but Maxwell was gradually persuaded by the logic of my position. Diana developed an enhanced security plan that would minimize physical risk. Dr. Levine provided specific preparation strategies to help me maintain psychological equilibrium during the encounter. Eventually, with reluctance but respect for my agency, my mother agreed to my participation under these controlled conditions. The meeting was arranged for the following week at a hotel conference room in a neighboring city. Diana's team would secure the location in advance and maintain both visible and concealed security presence throughout. Dr. Levine would be nearby, though not in the room itself, available for immediate support if needed. The meeting would be recorded with Martin's knowledge and limited to 1 hour. As the day approached, I worked with Dr. Levine on mental preparation. We practiced grounding techniques for managing anxiety. We discussed potential scenarios and appropriate responses. We established nonverbal signals I could use if I needed a break or felt overwhelmed. Most importantly, we clarified my role not as a vulnerable target, but as an active participant in addressing a situation that affected my life. The morning of the meeting arrived with a strange calm. I had expected to feel nervous, but instead experienced a focused readiness. My mother was more visibly anxious, checking her watch repeatedly as we traveled to the hotel. Maxwell maintained a composed exterior, though the tension in his shoulders revealed his underlying concern. Diana met us at a service entrance, escorting us through back corridors to avoid public areas. She briefed us on security measures in place and confirmed that Martin had arrived alone and submitted to a security check as agreed. The conference room had been arranged with careful attention to positioning. A round table rather than a rectangular one, eliminating hierarchical seating. Clear sightlines to exits. Panic buttons installed beneath the table at our positions. When we entered the room, Martin Frost stood to greet us. He was a surprise in his ordinariness. Average height, unremarkable features, precisely the kind of person who could blend into any setting without drawing attention. His suit was well-tailored but conservative, his manner polite but reserved. Nothing about his appearance suggested someone executing a years-long scheme of subtle intimidation. Maxwell took the lead in introductions, his tone professionally cordial despite the circumstances. My mother nodded stiffly, declining Martin's offered handshake. I studied him carefully, searching for signs of the malice that must drive his actions. His eyes, when they met mine, revealed nothing beyond polite acknowledgement. Once we were seated, Maxwell addressed the purpose of the meeting directly. He acknowledged awareness of Martin's recent financial activities and their proximity to our lives and interests. He expressed willingness to discuss whatever issues Martin wished to address. He emphasized preference for direct communication over indirect maneuvering. Martin listened attentively, hands folded on the table before him. When Maxwell finished, he thanked him for the opportunity to meet. His voice was measured, educated, with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to professional environments. He confirmed that his actions had indeed been deliberate rather than coincidental. Then he surprised us with his next statement. He was not acting on behalf of Victor Reynolds, at least not in the way we had assumed. Victor had died 6 months earlier of an aggressive cancer that had been diagnosed shortly after his transfer to the psychiatric facility. His death had not been publicized at his explicit request, documented in his final legal instructions. This revelation stunned us into momentary silence. Diana had not detected this information, despite her extensive monitoring. The psychiatric facility had maintained confidentiality about a patient's medical condition and subsequent death. Our entire premise for the meeting, that Martin was executing Victor's revenge plan, suddenly required reconsideration. Maxwell recovered first, expressing formal condolences while asking how Martin's recent activities related to Victor's death. Martin's response was both simple and complex. He was executing Victor's final wishes, but not as revenge, as restitution. According to Martin, Victor's psychiatric treatment had gradually broken through his defensive justifications, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions and their impact. The cancer diagnosis, with its implication of limited remaining time, had accelerated this process of reflection. Victor had spent his final months revising his will and instructions to Martin, his executor. The funds being accessed were not intended for harm, but for specific benefits carefully designed for each of us. The property purchased near my mother's bakery was to be donated to her company for expansion. The scholarship at my prospective university was established in my name for future distribution to students facing financial barriers similar to those I had once experienced. The investments in water purification companies were to be transferred to Stone Technologies on condition the technology be implemented in additional developing regions. Martin produced documentation supporting these claims, legal papers, transfer instructions, letters from Victor to each of us, written during his final weeks. Diana examined these documents carefully, checking for signs of falsification while we absorbed the implications of Martin's statements. If he was telling the truth, we had fundamentally misinterpreted his actions. What we had perceived as threatening proximity was actually preparation for beneficial transfers. What we had seen as psychological intimidation was an attempt at posthumous amends. What we had feared as revenge was intended as restitution. My mother expressed skepticism, pointing out that genuine restitution would not involve such secretive methods. True amends would begin with direct communication rather than mysterious financial maneuvers. Her concern was valid. If Victor's intentions were benevolent, why had Martin not simply approached us openly from the beginning? Martin's explanation was psychologically insightful. Victor had anticipated our suspicion. He understood that after his previous actions, any direct approach would be met with immediate rejection. The indirect method was designed to establish the reality of the benefits before revealing their source, allowing us to judge the gifts on their merits rather than their origin. As Martin spoke, I found myself studying the letters Diana had verified as authentic. Victor's handwriting was weaker than in his previous communication, evidence of his declining health. His tone was neither apologetic nor grandiose. He simply acknowledged specific harms he had caused each of us and outlined his attempt at proportional restitution. To my mother, he recognized the fear and insecurity his threats had created for a parent trying to protect her child. The property transfer was intended to provide additional business security and expansion opportunity, addressing the financial vulnerability his actions had exploited. To Maxwell, he acknowledged the betrayal of professional trust and partnership. The investment transfer was designed to further Maxwell's humanitarian vision for water technology, respecting the purpose Victor had once attempted to subvert for profit. To me, his words were most direct. He recognized that his actions had forced a 12-year-old girl to confront human cruelty before she should have needed to understand such things. The scholarship was intended to create future opportunity for others from similar backgrounds, transforming the negative impact on one child into positive impact for many. None of these gestures erased the harm done. Victor acknowledged this explicitly. Restitution was not redemption. It was simply an attempt to balance moral accounts to whatever limited extent possible before his death. He expected no forgiveness, asked for no posthumous rehabilitation of his reputation, sought no emotional closure for himself. As we absorbed this unexpected development, Dr. Levine was invited to join the discussion. Her psychological expertise might help us evaluate the authenticity and implications of Victor's posthumous gesture. After reviewing the letters and listening to Martin's explanation, she offered her professional assessment. The pattern described was consistent with genuine moral recognition rather than manipulation. Victor's actions showed proportionality between specific harms and attempted remedies. They acknowledged responsibility without seeking exoneration. They required no ongoing relationship or emotional engagement from us. These elements suggested authentic restitution rather than continued psychological manipulation. Maxwell asked for time to consider the situation privately. Martin agreed immediately, leaving us alone in the conference room to process what we had learned. The hour that followed was filled with intense discussion as we evaluated the evidence and our options. Diana's verification of the documents suggested the offers were legally sound. The benefits described were substantial and aligned with our actual needs and interests. There were no hidden conditions that might compromise us later. From a purely practical perspective, accepting these gifts would provide significant advantages, with minimal obvious drawbacks. But the psychological and moral dimensions were more complex. Accepting anything from Victor, even posthumously, created a connection we had worked for years to sever. It raised questions about complicity, about the price of benefit, about whether true closure required complete separation rather than final interaction. My mother expressed the core dilemma clearly. Rejecting the offers would maintain our moral independence, but sacrifice practical benefits that could help many people beyond ourselves. Accepting them would provide those benefits, but require acknowledging Victor's attempt at restitution, potentially complicating our emotional resolution of the past. As we debated, I found myself reflecting on the difference between revenge and justice that had guided our previous decisions. This situation presented a new distinction to consider: the difference between rejection and transcendence, between defining ourselves in opposition to Victor and moving beyond that definition entirely. I suggested an approach that acknowledged this distinction. We would accept the offers, but with significant modifications. The property would be donated to my mother's company, with a portion designated for community development in South Pinewood. The scholarship would be established, but renamed to honor educators who supported students from disadvantaged backgrounds rather than carrying any connection to Victor or this situation. The technology investments would be directed toward the specific regions Victor's broader business practices had once harmed. In this way, we would neither reject the practical benefits nor accept them on Victor's terms. We would transform his attempt at restitution into something that more fully addressed the systemic issues his actions had represented. We would move from personal resolution to broader justice. Maxwell immediately supported this approach. My mother considered it carefully before agreeing that it addressed both practical and psychological concerns. Dr. Levine noted that it represented a mature integration of past experience rather than either denial or capitulation. When Martin returned to the conference room, Maxwell presented our decision. Martin listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as the modifications were outlined. When Maxwell finished, Martin expressed neither surprise nor objection. He simply confirmed that, as executor, he would implement these changes while maintaining the core benefits Victor had intended. Before concluding the meeting, I asked Martin a question that had been forming in my mind throughout the discussion. Had Victor expressed any personal message beyond the formal restitution? Had there been any final insight or recognition he had wanted to convey? Martin considered the question carefully before answering. In their final conversation before Victor's death, he had said something that Martin had not included in the formal documentation because it seemed too personal. Victor had commented that the 12-year-old girl who dug him from the grave had ultimately buried him more completely than his partners ever could, not through violence or vengeance, but by demonstrating a different way to use power, a way he had never understood until it was too late to implement in his own life. As Martin shared this final message, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. Not forgiveness of Victor's actions, which remained unforgivable in their cruelty and impact, not sympathy for his belated recognition, which changed nothing about the harm he had caused, but acknowledgement that the cycle had truly ended, that the story that began with a buried man in the woods had reached its conclusion in a way none of us could have anticipated. The meeting ended with formal agreements about next steps. Martin would work with our legal representatives to implement the modified transfers. Diana would maintain monitoring until all transactions were complete. We would have no further direct contact unless specifically necessary for legal purposes. As we left the hotel through the same back corridors, my mother took my hand as she had when I was much younger. Maxwell walked beside us, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. None of us spoke until we reached the car that would take us home. Finally, my mother broke the silence. She asked how I felt about what had transpired, about Victor's posthumous attempt at restitution, about our decision to accept but transform his offerings, about the unexpected conclusion to a story that had defined so much of our lives for 5 years. I considered her question carefully. The experience had been surprising but not destabilizing. I had expected confrontation and found resolution instead. Not the resolution I would have chosen or that Victor deserved, but perhaps the one that best served the future rather than remaining fixated on the past. What I felt most strongly was not satisfaction or closure, but transcendence. We had moved beyond the reflexive rejection that would have kept us tethered to Victor's influence. We had refused the simple acceptance that would have granted him unearned absolution. We had instead transformed his gesture into something that aligned with our own values and vision. In doing so, we had demonstrated the truth I had glimpsed years earlier as a 12-year-old confronting adult cruelty for the first time, that the most powerful response to those who would bury you is not to merely survive or even to thrive despite them, but to transform the very soil they used against you into foundation for something they could never have imagined. This was not forgiveness. Victor Reynolds had died unworthy of that grace. It was not vindication. Our actions had been just regardless of his belated recognition. It was something more powerful than either. The freedom to define ourselves and our future according to our own values, rather than in reaction to his malice. As the car carried us home, I realized that this unexpected turn of events represented the most complete form of justice possible. Not because Victor had attempted restitution, but because we had reached a place where his actions no longer held power over our lives or decisions. We had not just escaped the grave he had dug. We had moved so far beyond it that it no longer marked our landscape at all. This was the revenge I had never sought but had achieved nonetheless. Not through hatred or harm, but through growth and transcendence. The ultimate response to those who would diminish your humanity. To expand it beyond their capacity to comprehend, creating something their limited vision could never have anticipated or contained. In the final analysis, Victor Reynolds had not been defeated by counterattack or exposed by investigation. He had been rendered irrelevant by transformation. And in that irrelevance lay the most complete justice any of us could have imagined. 10 years have passed since that meeting with Martin Frost. I am 27 now, a research scientist at Stone Environmental Institute, developing new applications for the water purification technology that once drove men to bury Maxwell Stone alive. My mother has retired from active management of her bakery chain, though she remains on the board and mentors young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. Maxwell continues to lead Stone Technologies, though he has gradually shifted more responsibility to a carefully selected executive team that shares his humanitarian vision. The property near my mother's bakery became the headquarters for a community development initiative that has transformed South Pinewood. What was once the struggling side of town now features thriving local businesses, improved schools and affordable housing that maintains neighborhood character rather than driving out original residents. The Scholarship Fund, renamed the Pinewood Future Leaders Program, has helped dozens of students from backgrounds similar to mine pursue higher education without the financial barriers I once faced.